Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
To Don G.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. My name is Don. I'm an alcoholic. Bob, you may not wish to engage in any sex, but that's your deal. I still don't find sex controversial, frankly. Oh, boy. I don't know what I look like to you all, but you ought to see it from this side up here. You all look magnificent. Absolutely marvelous. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much. I'm grateful to be here. I am an alcoholic. I am not an Arkansas Razorback football player, and tonight for that I am extremely grateful. However, that's not my fault, okay? And I'm glad you're in here instead of out there. Shows you how well you're coming along in your sobriety, and me too. Oh boy, I want to thank Bob W., who is an anonymous mover and shaker for this convention, and who I just happen to know is directly responsible for me being here, and I appreciate that very much, Bob. And I want to thank Doug and everybody on the committee very much, and I want to thank Bob for being my host, and I just want to thank Fort Smith for being here. I come from the Cosmopolitan AA group in Little Rock, Arkansas. Yay, yeah. I am not going to stand here, y'all, and tell you that Cosmo is the best AA group in the world. However, we are in the top 3. And the other 2 have come and asked us for instructions. Cosmo is a gift. It has been in existence since the early 1950s. That's a long time. And we have a lot of old-timers at Cosmo. You heard one of them this afternoon, my friend Frank. Frank, I don't think ever did get around to telling you that he's been sober. It's either 34 or 35 years. You all have old-timers here also. We had on Friday night, we had Joe. And, you know, I had not ever heard Joe before, but I was sitting next to Frank. And Joe started to talk, and Frank turned to me, and he said, "You know, I always wondered what happened to that guy." Hey, you know, what's 35 years, 40 years, you know, what's a big deal? But the reason that's important to me is because in this program, I happen to have been raised up by old-timers. And that, you know, that doesn't make me any better or any worse than anybody else. It just is. The guy who ended up being my first sponsor, at the time he began sponsoring me, he was 17 years sober. And he sponsored me until he died for 7 years. And if he were still alive today, well, he was a contemporary of Frank's, and he'd be 35, 36 years sober. And, of course, he introduced me to old-timers, men and women, people from the old school, people who grew up in what they used to call the Little Rock approach plan to Alcoholics Anonymous, which was a real blood and guts, rough and tumble approach. And that's the way I raised up around this program. And, you know, some folks like that sort of thing and some folks don't, but for me it's a real gift. and it's a real pleasure. This has been an absolutely wonderful program. I just, here in Fort Smith, I really, really enjoyed hearing what Joe had to say on Friday night. Linda and I have decided that we saved you all from chaos and calamity because we didn't get together. We used to be on opposite sides of her profession. She was the seller and I was the buyer, and we never matched up, and there ain't no telling what would have happened if we had. And, of course, Frank and people of Frank's vintage that I like to think of as being treasures in this program. Frank and Joe, you know who they are. And I thought that Mitch was exceptionally good today, and I really appreciated what he had to say. And I'm just a little bit ahead of you with regards to Supersonic Scott. And after you hear him tomorrow morning, you'll know what I'm talking about. And like Linda said, fasten your seatbelt. I heard Scott for the first time down in Little Rock last February. And there's a lot of jet planes in Scott's story. And when I got here early yesterday, and they were warming up for the air show outside, you know. And I got into my room, and it sounded like there was a jet that was on the roof right above me, you know. The window was rattling. And I heard that, and I said, God, that's Scott. He just arrived, and he's drunk again. But fortunately, somebody else was flying the plane this time. I am truly honored to be amongst such people who are sharing the podium. You know what I'm going to do. You know, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like now. And this always comes out a little bit different. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm here, and that's what my sponsor taught me to do, was to show up and open up, and that's what I do. I won't bore you with a whole lot from my childhood and my long ago past, but there are a couple of things that are important for you to know because they set the stage for what was to come later. I want to tell you that I had great parents. You know, nobody abused me. I was not duct taped in a closet. I had great parents. They were strict. And I have two older brothers, and we were all raised the same way. Neither one of them is alcoholic. As far as I know, nobody else in my family is alcoholic. And after I got sober, the three of us brothers sat down together, and we were talking. And I said, we were talking about the way our mother used to discipline us. She was a disciplinarian. And I was telling a story about how she disciplined me one time, and I said, am I remembering that wrong, or did she do that? Did she do that to you all? And one of my brothers said to me, he said, yeah, Don, she did that to us. She did that to all of us. But you're the only one that ever seemed to bother. And therein lies the story. You see, I'm not like them. They are not alcoholic. And I am. I have this super sensitivity, you know. I don't see things the same way that they do. The earliest thing that I remember when I was a little kid was I remember being scared. I was just a scared kid. I came out that way. Nobody abused me. Nobody did anything to me. I was just a scared kid. And what I was scared of is I was scared of you. I was afraid of whoever was in charge. I was afraid of any of you all grouped and gathered together and standing there and laughing at me. I was afraid you wouldn't like me. I was afraid you'd be angry with me, and I don't know where that came from. I know it's still there today, even knowing everything that I know. But I can be relieved from that fear one day at a time based upon the maintenance of my spiritual condition. And so, gosh, you all, I would look at you all, and there you were, all gathered up in groups, you know. You ever seen how people gather up in groups, you know? You got the cheerleaders and the jocks over here, and you got the geeks and the nerds over here, and you got these different groups of people in between those extremes. People just congregate in groups. And the worst thing I thought that could possibly happen to you was to not be in any group. And everybody's rolled up in groups, and they're standing there looking at me, and they're laughing at me, you know? And so I learned when I was a little kid on the playground in elementary school that what I got to do is I got to get in one of these groups. Now, I knew that I couldn't fake out the cheerleaders and the jocks. And I didn't think that I wanted to be in with the geeks and the nerds. So I learned in elementary school and in Cub Scouts that you pick out a group that's in the middle, you know? And what you do is you start hanging around them. And you dress the way they dress, you act the way they act, you talk the way they talk, and you do the things they do. And if you're lucky, they'll say, yeah, Don, come on in here and be with us, you know? And that's what I showed you. What I didn't show you was this fear. And this fear had a couple of very, very strong physical manifestations in me. This fear always was this twist in my gut and this lump in my throat. But I wouldn't let you see that. And if I dress the way you dress, act the way you act, talk the way you talk, do the things you do, and you say, come on in here and get in this group, then I'll stand there with my mask on. See, I'm fine. I'm fine. See? And what I'm not showing you is this that's in my gut and this that's in my chest. And that's the way I started, and I got really, really good at that, y'all. Boy, I tell you, I did that on the playground in elementary school. I did it in Cub Scouts. I did it in Little League. I did it in junior high school. And in the summer in between my junior and senior year of high school, my family pulled up stakes and moved from Memphis to Little Rock. I was 16 years old. And so I came over to Little Rock. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew me. And I take a step back, and I'm looking at the big picture here, and there you are. Cheerleaders and the jocks, geeks and the nerds, all the groups in between. And I did what I was so good at. I picked out one of those groups in the middle, and I did my thing. I started hanging around them, and I dress the way they dress, and I act the way they act, and I talk the way they talk, and I do the things they do, and they say, come on in here, Don, be one of us. And in I went with that plastic smile on my face and that twist in my gut and that lump in my chest, and I'm in there. And that was in the early 60s. In Little Rock, Arkansas. And what we used to do in the early 60s in Little Rock, Arkansas is we used to cruise the drive-ins. And this group that I hung out with, the guy who had the car, Big Gary, he drove an Edsel. And Edsels were big back then. Joe told you that last night. Edsels were big back then. And Gary drove the Edsel, and my place in the Edsel was in the back seat, left-hand corner, behind the driver, okay? So back then, you're cruising the drive-ins, and you got these cold quart bottles of beer. And, you know, that's back in the days when you had to have a church key, you know. And the way the process worked was the guy who was riding shotgun would open the quart bottle of beer, and he'd take a big slug off of it and hand it to the guy in the middle, big slug, hand it to the driver, big slug, and then the driver would grab a hold of that quart bottle by the neck and hand it back over his head to me, the guy behind the driver in the left-hand seat. And I would reach up and get that cold quart bottle of beer, take a big hit off of it, and pass it over to the guy next to me. And then back there in the corner, in the dark, I would choke down that big slug of beer. And the reason for that is because I didn't like beer. And I surely do not want to offend you beer drinkers. I really don't. Because I know you guys are serious about that stuff. But I'll tell you this, I don't know if I'll ever get drunk again, but I promise you if I do, it won't be on beer. I didn't escape, believe me. As much as I didn't like beer, I loved whiskey, okay? But the point is that I'm choking down this beer in the dark because you all are drinking that beer, and I got to do that. I got to do what you're doing to be in that crowd with you. Now, the other thing that used to go on back in those days is it was an innocent time. And the high school would put on a sock hop in the gym once a month. And everybody would go to the sock hop. And you'd take your shoes off and go into the gym, and the boys would line up on one side and the girls would line up on the other side. No man's land is out there in the middle, you know. Cheerleaders and the jocks got out there together in no man's land. None of me. I ain't talking none of you girls. Scared. I just kind of stand there and try not to look too scared. Well, out in the parking lot, in the dark parking lot, we had our cars out there, and iced down in the trunk of the cars is this beer. So you'd stand there and try and look cool for a while, and you'd kind of ease over to the door of the gym, and as soon as you hit the door and you were out of sight of the teachers, you'd boogie back to the parking lot back there where it's dark. And you stand around there and guzzle down this cold beer. I'm choking it down with you, you know. And then you boogie back to the gym, stand there and look cool. And that's what we were doing at the second sock hop of the year in September of 1963. And I had been out to the dark parking lot 2, 3, 4 times, just like always. And I was on my way back from the parking lot to the gym, and something miraculous happened. On the way back, all of a sudden, the twist in the gut untwisted, and the lump in the chest melted. And I stood up straight, and I was 6'4" and good looking. And I walked up to the doors of the gym, and I pushed them open kind of like John Wayne when he used to walk up to the saloon, you know. And I'm standing there like this, and some cute little old girl walked by in front of me, and she said something to me, and I opened my mouth, and the coolest stuff you ever heard fell out. And in a couple of minutes, a crowd had gathered around me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be in your crowd, you were trying to be in mine. And that was 35 years ago, and I remember it like it was last night, and I'll never forget it, and it's one of the greatest experiences I ever had. And I drank almost every day for the next 27 years, and every time that I did, I was looking for that same feeling. Every time. Never again was it ever as good as it was that night. But boy, I want to tell you, for a long time, there was a bunch of times it came really close. And that's what happened. And that's what happened. Just that simple. I'm just like you. I'm just one of those people that alcohol did a magic thing for, you know? And, gosh, my life, the way it spread out, you know, I was one of those kids who there were plans for me based on my potential. And so I was a good boy. I was a good boy. I always went to school. I did what my parents told me to do. My parents told me to come in the family business. I did that. My parents told me to stay home and go to college and work in the family business while I was there, and that I'd get a head start into my career, and I did that. And I got exactly what they said I would get. By the time I was 30 years old, I was fabulously successful. And most of my friends were just getting started. And I was established. I was wealthy when I was 30 years old, at least on paper, and that's all that mattered. And a really interesting thing happened as a result of that I didn't realize for several years later. But you know, as I accumulated more of those things, I couldn't understand why you all would want to have anything to do with me. So therefore, you must have an angle, you know? You must want to get your hand in my pocket. That's the only reason you'd want to be a friend of mine. And so over a period of a few years, I pushed all of you away from me. I divested myself of you. And I finally got to the point where I had 1,000 acquaintances, but I didn't have anybody that you'd call a friend. I didn't have anybody who I'd talk to the way I'm talking to you right now. And I didn't know. See, I didn't know until long after the fact that what I got from that was isolated and alone. And for an alcoholic like me, if you leave me isolated and alone, you might as well put a gun to my head and cock the hammer. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And I wouldn't let you tell me that that was bull, that it was normal to be lonely if you had all these things. I wouldn't let you close enough to tell me that. And so I put together this, I really like what Mitch called it this afternoon. I put together this picket fence life, you know, the beautiful trophy wife, the big house, the 2.4 wonderful kids, the legion of cars, you know, and I was a very public person in Little Rock. I made damn sure you knew who I was. I made sure you knew who I was. And I was a legend in my own mind, you know. And I did that all through the late 1970s and the early and middle 1980s. And I made it, I accomplished all my goals. I mean, I made it really to where I wanted to be. And it looked like it would just go on forever. And hard drinking was a part of my makeup, you know. I did not drink during the day, during business hours. But when it was time to close up shop, close the office, I turned the key in the lock and I stayed there. And that was where my drinking began. And it went with a bunch of roadie cups into the car for the trip home, and the rest of the night that I was home until I passed out in bed. And I knew I was doing it right, y'all. I knew I was doing it right because I had what you wanted. And if I was wrong, this wouldn't be working. And you weren't there to tell me that I was wrong about that. Not because you didn't care, because I wouldn't let you. I wouldn't let you tell me about that. And so on it goes, and the economy is booming, and it looks like it'll go on forever, and in some pretty inebriated self-aggrandizement and just, you know, glorious thoughts of myself, I committed myself to some unrealistic growth goals and debt, assuming that this would go on forever. I was telling Linda when we were at the banquet today, you know, my dad, I used to tell my dad my plans, and he'd say, Don, you can't do that. You don't tell that to an alcoholic, man. You just don't tell that to an alcoholic. Every time he said that, I went out and proved to him that I will do that. And they said, people said that about these plans that I had. They said, Don, you can't do that. Hey, I'll show you. One time too many. Along about the mid-'80s, it all turned upside down financially. The oil money went bust. The real estate money went bust. This wild free spending went bust. And here I was out on the end of this very long limb, owing millions of dollars in debt. And that was when $1 million was really a lot of money. And boy, I tell you what, for the first time in a long, long time, I got scared again. And the old twist in the gut started to come back. And the old lump in the chest started to come back. And I hadn't felt them in a very long time. And I did something very uncharacteristic for me at that time. I asked for help. Very uncharacteristic, because I don't need your damn help. I'll do it. But I went and I found 3 of what I considered to be the smartest businessmen I knew. And I asked them to advise me like a board of directors. I was telling Bill the other day, one of the guys looks exactly like him, and every time I look at him, it's like deja vu. There's Ben again, you know. I got to get you guys together sometime, Bill. You see what I mean? Because he saved my life. Ben saved my life. Anyway, these 3 guys, what they tried to do is they tried to establish a discipline for me. They tried to make me accountable for my actions. And boy, I'll tell you, for a wild and free thing like me, that was really hard. We struggled with each other. In the meantime, business was getting worse. Economic outlooks were getting worse. And one afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 months into this thing with this board of directors, we had been struggling with each other all day long, and we were all just sitting around the board table just exhausted. And one of these guys, Ben, looked at me, and he said, "Don, we want to ask you a question." And I said, "Sure." He said, "We want to know, how much have you been drinking?" And I almost fell right out of the chair. Nobody had ever had the nerve or the gall to ask me a question like that before. Hell, I'd fire your ass if you asked me that. And I could fire anybody, you know. And I don't know what came over me in that instant, but for some reason, maybe it's because it was Ben, I don't know. But for some reason, I felt the necessity to tell him the truth. And I said, "Well, you know, maybe I have been drinking more than I normally drink. You know, maybe I have. You know, we've been struggling. Nothing seems to work. Everything I used to do that would turn everything into magic and gold doesn't work anymore. And you know, I haven't been sleeping well at nights. And maybe I have been drinking more than I've even been aware of." And he was so calm and gentle with me. He said, "It's okay. It's all right. We just want you to promise us that you'll go get some help for that." And I said, "Okay, I will." And I always did what I said, y'all. And so I went and I got some help. I went to see my psychiatrist. And my psychiatrist examined me mentally, physically, from top to bottom. Never mentioned anything about drinking and dope smoking, both of which I was doing a lot of. And finally, at the end of the examination, he says, "Don," he says, "I think I can help you." He says, "I think that what you are is depressed. And I have a medication that I think will help you with this depression. But there's a hitch," he says. "This is a toxic substance, and you can't drink with this medication. So if we're going to do this, you're going to have to give up that drinking." And by that time, y'all, I was uncomfortable enough to where I said, "Okay, I'll do that. I'll stop drinking to take this medication." And then he says, "And while you're at it, I also want you to stop this dope smoking." And I said, "Why's that? Does that marijuana not mix well with the medication? And he said, no, that's not it. Brad, this is for you. He says, Don, you're a prominent businessman in this town, and that's against the law. And I said, let me get this straight. You're telling me that you don't have a medical reason for me to stop smoking this dope. You're just telling me that you're afraid I'm going to get busted by some cops? Me? I said, I ain't going to do it, man. I ain't going to do it. I had my yeah but all figured out. You know, I only bought my marijuana in less than 1 ounce sizes, which is a misdemeanor. I never sold it. I never even gave it away. I never shared it. It was all for me. And I told him, I said, I ain't doing it. And he very reluctantly had to accept that. And I just didn't know. See, y'all, I just didn't know. I didn't know that, and I speak now just for this alcoholic here, okay? I'm not speaking for anybody else, but this is me and my experience. I didn't know that it doesn't make any difference what mood-altering substance you put into this system. You're going to get the same result coming out on the other end. And it doesn't matter whether it's marijuana or whether it's cocaine or whether it's prescription drugs or whether it's alcohol or anything else you can think of. So I stopped drinking, and I kept on smoking dope. And he gave me this very strong antidepressant medication, and to help it go down a little easier and to take the edge off, he gave me a couple of open-ended side prescriptions, multiple refills, one for Xanax and one for Valium. And as I always like to say when I tell this story back home, because there's a guy there named Dr. Bob who watched me do this, and he says, I watched Don do this. Don just went away. And that's what I did. I just went away. I don't know where I went, but it wasn't where the board of directors was struggling with a business. It wasn't where the economy was upside down. It was someplace else, you know. People would say, Don, how are you today? And I'd go, I'll have to get back to you on that one. And while I was away, the whole house of cards started to fall in. And the bank foreclosed. Imagine that, the bank foreclosed. And they told me I'd have to go find another home for all this debt. And I took my humble hat and I went everywhere asking everybody, and nobody's picking up debt because they all know what's coming. Not just with me, with everybody. And I asked everybody, and everybody turned me down. I combed the state, and then I went to the major financial capitals, and in the end, I ended up in Boca Raton, Florida, asking the mafia for the money. And even they turned me down. They said, get out of here. Get out of here. We don't mess with little things like you. And I came home from all of that, and I was sitting alone, as always, in my office one Saturday morning, and hadn't had a drink of whiskey in 7 months. And I'm sitting there, and this little voice came over the top of my left ear, just as clear as a bell. And it said, hey, Don. Huh? You remember what it used to feel like, Don, at the end of a long, hard day of working, when you'd pop the cap on that bottle of whiskey and pour a couple of fingers over ice and take that first slug? You remember, man, when it was coming down here and it had hit that lump in your chest, and that lump would start to melt, and it'd wiggle on down to where that twist was, and it just kind of blow that twist apart. You remember that? And I said, I sure do. Wouldn't you like to feel that again? I sure would. But I can't. Why not? Can't drink. Can't drink on this medication. Oh, come on, man. We're not talking about drinking. We're talking about having a drink. That's not drinking. You know what drinking is. Having a drink is not drinking. You can have a drink, can't you? Damn right I can. Damn right I can. I walked down the steps and got in the car, and I drove over to Baker's Liquor Store at 9th and Rock. And I walked in where all my buds were. They all knew me. Hi, Don. And I looked around, and the countertop special that day, the dusty half pints that they weren't selling too well, was Quality House vodka in the blue label, $1.67 a half pint. I'll never forget that drink. Never. And I bought one of those and a cup of ice, and I went across the street to MacArthur Park, and I poured half of that half pint over that ice, and the other half of the half pint I poured out on the ground. I am a good boy. I follow directions. We are having a drink. A drink. And I sat back and took a long pull off of that vodka on ice, and boy, you know what it did. I can taste it right now, man. It hit the back of my throat, and it came down to that lump there, and it started to melt away, and it wiggled down to where that twist was, and it boomed it out, and I opened my mouth and took a deep breath, and I hadn't had a deep breath in a long time. And I said, ah, there it is, just the way I remembered it. Within 6 months, I was drinking the better part of a gallon of vodka a day and taking the antidepressant medication and smoking 6, 8, 10 joints a day and popping handfuls of Xanax and Valium. And when you're using substances like that, a lot of stuff happens to you. Not the least of which is you get paranoid. And I was paranoid. Everybody was out to get me. You know, the bank was out to get me. The board of directors was out to get me. My family was out to get me. My customers were out to get me. My creditors were out to get me. And when everybody's out to get you, you've got to protect yourself. So I'm carrying a loaded 9mm automatic in my back pocket. And I got a Smith & Wesson nickel-plated .357 Magnum under the seat of the car. And when I go home at night and I pass out in bed, I'm passing out on a pillow that's got a snub-nosed .38 Special under it. And I'm picking fights with my wife at about 8 or 9 o'clock at night so that I can angrily storm out of the house. And I storm out of the house and I go to the liquor store and I buy me a bottle of vodka and I just start driving around. I got a loaded gun on the seat next to me and I'm swigging off that bottle of vodka, and around midnight I'll wind up at one of your houses, my bank loan officer, and I'll just sit there and hit off of that bottle with that gun sitting on the seat next to me, and I'll stare at your front door. And I'd say, if you'll just come out of that house, I'll blow you away, because this is all your fault. You want to know about resentment? I can teach you a few things about hate and resentment. And you know what? You never came out the door, because you didn't know I was out there. If you'd known I was out there, you'd have called the cops, you know? And a couple of days after Thanksgiving, right in this season of the year, this is my season, and when this time of the year rolls around, I relive this story. I have done it every year for the last 12 years. A couple of days after Thanksgiving, and I came in at 1 o'clock in the morning after one of these escapades, and my wife was waiting up for me. That didn't happen. And the reason she was waiting up for me was because she had gotten a phone call from her family in Texas, and it was a piece of bad news. I didn't really care. But she waited up to tell me, and I know you all are familiar with the expression, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that's what happened. I walked in and she told me this news about her family, and I broke. I just broke. I went berserk. I went out of my mind. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I started tearing the house down. I pulled draperies off the wall. I broke up the furniture. I was throwing the china. And in her terror, my wife ran out of the house and ran next door and woke up the neighbors and called my brother, who doesn't live very far away. And she said, something is bad wrong with Don, and you better come and help me. And my brother said to my wife, Don is an armed and dangerous person, and I am afraid to go near him. And I don't want you going back in there either. You stay where you are. I'm calling the police. And that's what they did. And in the interim, I tore the house down. I tore the house down. I screamed until I couldn't scream anymore. I had no voice left, and all of my strength had drained out of my body. And I sat down in the middle of the floor. And while I was sitting there, I heard the doorbell ring. And it rang and rang and rang. I heard it. And I remember thinking to myself, there isn't anybody who could be on the other end of that door that I would have anything to say to. Just leave me alone. I quit. I'm out of here. I'm done. Leave me alone. And a little more time went by and somebody saying, Mr. Gold, Mr. Gold. And who that was 4 of Little Rock's finest. That was the police. They were in my house with drawn weapons, searching room to room for this deranged, armed, and dangerous person. And this policeman came into the room where I was, and he saw me just sitting there and that I wasn't holding a gun at him. And he let out this sigh of relief. He was scared, let me tell you. And he put his gun away, and he stooped down in front of me, and he put his hands on my shoulders, and I opened my eyes, and there's 4 huge cops are standing there, and they startled me, and I said, what are you all doing here? You know, in a situation like that, the police can respond a lot of different ways. I know that as long as I stay sober, however long that may be, or however short that may be, I will never forget the compassion in that policeman's voice when he answered me. He said, Mr. Gold, we came to help you. He didn't have to do that. And I thought, help me? Nobody comes to help me. I didn't ask for your damn help, I'm thinking. I help you, you don't help me. And I got ready to answer him. And he said, we want to take you to the hospital. And something happened in that split second, in that moment. And I opened my mouth, and 3 words fell out that are the 3 most important words I have ever uttered in my entire life. I think the 3 most important words I ever will utter. And I don't know where they came from because they're totally out of character for me at that time. It just wasn't my deal to say something like this. He said, we want to take you to the hospital. And I looked at him and I said, whatever you say. And I realized in that moment that this man could tell me that he wanted me to do anything at all, and I would do it. He could tell me that he wanted me to go out back in the backyard and stand up against a tree and stand still while he shot me to put me out of my misery, and I'd do it. It was a long time later that I understood that that was the moment of step 1. Complete and total surrender. I will do whatever you say. And so they loaded me up in the back of a squad car in one of Little Rock's most exclusive neighborhoods, with the blue lights going around and around and all the neighbors standing on the street corner watching me. And that's how I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. I got in the hospital, and they were scared. They were afraid I was going to go comatose on them. They wouldn't let me go to sleep because of all the things that were in my system. And, it was a tough detox, in 4-point restraints. And a couple of days later, they brought me in front of my psychiatrist again. He was just pale as a ghost. He couldn't believe it. But sitting next to him was another psychiatrist. And this psychiatrist was a recovering alcoholic. And he looked at me and he said, "Don, we think you're an alcoholic." And y'all, I was so rum-dum, I almost said, "What the hell is that?" I didn't have a clue. He said, "We want you to stay here in the hospital and enter this program for recovery from alcoholism." And I said, "Whatever you say." He said, "We want you to sign power of attorney over to your board of directors, your team of lawyers, and your family, and just stay here and do this thing." And I said, "Whatever you say." And they said, "We don't want you to go anywhere, and we don't want you to do anything except what we think is best for you to do." And I said, "Whatever you say." And that was the morning of December the 1st, 1987. And I have been doing whatever you say every day for 4,359 days since then, right up to tonight. And that's how I do this program. I just do whatever you say. And so if Doug calls me up and says, "We want you to come to Fort Smith to talk," I do whatever you say. And if my sponsor says, "I want you to come over here and volunteer answering the telephone at the AA Central office," I say, "I do whatever you say." And if somebody says, "Will you sponsor me?" and I say, "I'll do whatever you say." And that I have not lost yet, and I don't intend to. Well, I'm in the hospital, and I'd like to get out, I'd like to get out. I mean, I'm going to do your treatment program, but I'd like to get out of the hospital, please. Well, you can't get out of the hospital unless you got a sponsor. They had taken me to an AA meeting in the interim. They had taken me to Wolf Street in Little Rock. And I just barely remember being there. Don't remember what they were talking about. Let me back up. I left out one real important thing before the sponsor thing. In the hospital, they take me in a room, and there's 5 or 6 or 7 people there. They're all in this treatment program. And they all get up, and they all introduce themselves to me. My name's Sharon. I'm an addict. My name's Brian. I'm an alcoholic. My name's Stuart. I'm an alcoholic and an addict. And I said, "My name's Don, and I really don't know what I am." And they all laughed at me. That's the deal. There you are, the group, laughing at me. That's primal with me, And there was one guy in that group named Mike, and he saw how hurt and upset I was. And he came around the table, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Sure, Don, we know you don't know. That's why you're here. Sit down here." And these people went around the table, and each one of them took 5 minutes each, and they told me why they believed they were an alcoholic or an addict or an alcoholic and an addict. And I sat there listening to what these people were saying in utter amazement. They were talking about never feeling like they ever fit anywhere. They were talking about people always being in these groups over here with the cheerleaders and the jocks and the geeks and the nerds. And they were talking about having this twist in your gut and this lump in your chest. And the group standing there and laughing at you. And I'm sitting there listening to these people say this, and I'm thinking, how the hell do you know that? I never told that to anybody. Those are my deepest secrets. How do you know that? And all of a sudden it kind of dawned on me, you know? It's like somebody reached in and turned on the light. They all said, you all said you were alcoholic. And you were describing your insides, and they were exactly the same as mine. Hell, I must be one of those alcoholics too. And that was when I identified. That was not only when I found out that I was an alcoholic, but that was when I found out what an alcoholic is. And I know you've got your own definition of what an alcoholic is. I know I've got mine, and I'll tell you what mine is. I'm an alcoholic. That's what an alcoholic is. And I know that better than I know anything else anywhere. Now, I want to go home. You got to have a sponsor. So I start looking around for sponsors. By the time I finish looking around, I don't think Bill Wilson could have sponsored me. He wouldn't have qualified. You know how we do. So there's this guy I've met, and I says to him, Sid, here's what the problem is. And he says, Don, he says, if I were you, I would go out to a meeting where there's a lot of men, old-time sobriety, and I would just tell them, I need a sponsor. Help me. And he said, the place to go is Cosmopolitan's Deer Camp meeting. And that's the Wednesday night men's meeting. It's as old as the hills. They've been doing it since the 60s. And a lot of crusty old-timers in there. And Sid said, go there. And I said, whatever you say. So I went to the deer camp. And they always start, that meeting's about sponsorship, and they always start that meeting the same way. They say, is there anybody here who needs a sponsor? And I jumped up in front of this meeting of 65 men, and I said, my name's Don, and I'm an alcoholic. And I need a sponsor, and I'd like to interview several people after the meeting. When their laughter finally died down, the guy Pete, who was chairing the meeting, I'll never forget this. This is exactly what Pete said. He said, Don, we don't have to make it that complicated. He said, how about if I just appoint you one? And I said, whatever you say. And he looked around and he zeroed in on this crusty old guy. Oh. And Charlie, he said, Charlie, will you sponsor this guy? And Charlie looked at me like I was the reincarnation of the bubonic plague. And he starts to shake his head like this, and I'm going, oh no. And finally at the last second he says, okay. He says, you meet me over in the corner after the meeting. After the meeting I go over in the corner, and this little old man looked a lot like me. Short, fat, bald, beard, gray. I didn't used to look like that, but after he got through with me. And this little old man looked at me and he said, I want to ask you one question. And I said, yes, sir. He said, are you willing to go to any lengths to get sober in this program? And I said, what does that mean? He said, that means, are you willing to do whatever I ask you to do, with the understanding that I did it myself? And I said, I will do whatever you say. And the next day he brought me a worksheet list. That's a Little Rock tradition amongst the old-timers. Mine was a list of 21 men and women that he thought I ought to get to know as the beginning of a community foundation in my program. And he told me to go to those people one at a time and listen to their story And I did that. And those people formed the foundation of my program. A couple of years ago, when I celebrated 10 years, I dragged my worksheet out, and of the original 21, 11 were still alive and still sober. And I called them up one at a time, and I said, God, that was 10 years ago I came to see you. We must have done something right, I guess. And I thanked them. And that was a real trip to be able to do that. Charlie says to me, you know anything about vegetable gardening? And I said, no. He said, would you like to learn? And I said, really, not particularly. He said, you and me are going to garden vegetables. I am a vegetable gardener, he said. And we went down to the old penal farm, and we rented a couple of plots, garden plots. And we started at the beginning with how you till it up and how you hoe up rows and how you lay out your garden plan for what's going to grow where and how you stake the tall stuff here and there and the rest of it. And when we tilled up the first row, he said, come down here, I want to show you how you plant the seed. And I got down on my knees next to this old man in this garden, and he said, as long as we're down here, let's try the Serenity prayer. And that was the first time I ever prayed on my knees. And, it's a funny thing about gardens. When it's hot, you gotta water them every morning and weed them. And then you got to come back at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and water them again, And I'd meet Charlie down there every morning at 7 o'clock. And I can still see him leaning on his hoe with the sun coming up behind him. And I'm walking up to him. Well, what is it, boy? And I'd tell him. While I'm weeding and watering, I'd tell him. And he'd listen and listen and listen, and then he'd say, okay, you can go do this and this. Forget the rest of it. You can go do this and this, go to a noon meeting, come back at 5:30 and tell me how it went. And that's what I did every day for 18 months, and that's what it took for me to get sober. And while all that was going on, whoa, what they were doing. Whoa. I mean, the judges and the lawyers and the bankruptcies and the debt and they call me in the meetings and they say, sit down here and sign when we tell you to sign and don't say anything. And I don't know how the hell they worked that out, but I lost everything. The only thing I didn't do, I was going to say I didn't walk away with a debt, but I did. I walked away with a huge consent judgment, but the lawyer said it's funny money. You'll never have to pay this. What he didn't say was you'll never have to worry about this. And I worried about that funny money consent judgment until I was 5 years sober. And when I was 5 years sober, they settled that multi-million-dollar consent judgment for a $10,000 cash payment. Go figure that one out. And that was finally the end of my wreckage of the past. It took 5 years for that to happen. But these people held my hand through all of this. And I lost everything except the house and the wife. I didn't lose the house because by law they can't take that. I still haven't figured out why the wife didn't leave. But I will forever be grateful that she didn't. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary the last day of August. 8 years drunk and 12 years sober. And we're in it now for the duration. She's got enough of this program now to where she knows how to counteract my stuff when I come up with it. That's the way she refers to me, incidentally. I am her stuff. I kind of like that, to tell you the truth. Oh, And away I did go into this program, you know. My career was gone, my reputation was gone, my credit rating was gone. But these directors had insisted on an annuity guarantee for me. Small, very small compared to what I used to make, less than a third of what I used to make. But it's been enough to live on. And it had a vocational rehabilitation component to it. And I sent a guy out, and he said, "You're not equipped to do anything." So I went back to school because I didn't know what else to do. And I didn't really go back to school to get a new career. I went back to school to try to learn a little more about myself. And I will say that for me, the social work curriculum did that very, very well. Not only did it teach me an awful lot about myself, but it taught me a lot about some things that I never knew anything about. Empathy, tolerance, understanding, walking in somebody else's shoes before I judge them. And you match that up next to what the AA that I was getting, and I was getting mega doses of this side of life, and I had never seen it before. When I was, I can't remember. Back when I was still in the hospital, before they let me out of the hospital, they had decided they were going to let me out for a weekend just to see how I would do. And on the way out, one of the guys I was in treatment with said, "You know, Don, you might not do so well without us. And just in case you don't, come on down to Wolf Street on Saturday at 1 o'clock. There's going to be a meeting, and I'm going to be there." "Yeah, sure, okay." Well, I didn't do well. And so I went down to that meeting. And I wasn't going in that house by myself, and so I waited for him outside, and he never showed up. And at a couple of minutes before 1, I was going to go back to the car and leave. And this feeling came over me that said, "You know, that's what you always do. You just go off by yourself." And I just said, "I can't do that anymore. I can't stand it anymore." And I walked up to the green door at Wolf Street, and my heart was in my throat, and I pushed open the door, and I walked in. And as I came around the bend in the lobby, I ran smack dab into the guy who, back in high school, used to drive the Edsel and hand the bottle of beer back over his head. And he laughed at me and he said, "Sit down here, Don. We've been keeping this seat warm just for you." And I sat down in that meeting, and I mean, you know, I was still having withdrawals. And one minute I was sweating, and the next minute I was freezing, and I was shaking. And they had this AA meeting, and I don't know what it was about. And I don't know what they were talking about, but 3/4 of the way through the meeting, I sort of came to, and I was standing up in the middle of the room. And everybody was looking at me. And you could have heard a pin drop. And the guy who was chairing the meeting, he says, "Is there something you wanted to say?" And I said, "Y'all, I don't understand what's happening here. You know, I've been sitting here, and I've been sweating, and I've been freezing, and I feel like there's this poison in me, and it's all oozing out of me, and I don't understand what's happening here." I was standing in front of a post, and it had a bumper sticker right over my head that said, "This too shall pass." And there was a guy on the back row of the meeting, and he was leaning back in his chair, and he was rocking back and forth on the 2 back legs of his chair, and he's just looking at me like this. And I just stood there. I said, "I don't understand what's happening." And after a moment of silence of this guy looking at me, he kind of smirked at me and he said, "Welcome home." And I realized in that moment that that is exactly where I was, and that up until then I had never been there before. And I have come to learn that home is not where you hang your clothes up at night, and it's not where you necessarily lay down to sleep, and it's not the garage that you put your car in. Home is where the people are who know your insides as well or better than you know them yourself. And I had never been there before that moment. And I've never been anywhere else since then. And we went on, you know. And days became weeks, and weeks became months, and months became years. And one day, right at this time of the year, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, at 7 years of sobriety, I'm answering the phone up at the central office. That's where the rubber meets the road, boy. That's where the drunks call in who say, I can't stop, I need help. And the phone rang, and it was Charlie, my sponsor, and he said, when you get finished up there, come over. I said, okay. And I went over, and he took me back in the back room, and he closed the door. And he said, I had known that Charlie had suffered through emphysema, beat it back into remission. He'd suffered through lung cancer, beat it back into remission. And he took me back there and closed the door, and he looked at me, and he said, Don, he said, the cancer's back, and this time it's terminal. He said, nobody knows this except my wife and me and you. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving, and the family's coming in. And so I don't want you to tell anybody. He said, I haven't even told this to my sponsor, because my sponsor's got a big mouth, and if I tell him, all of AA will know. And he said, so I don't want you to tell this to anybody until Monday. And I said, whatever you say. And I left, and I was dumbstruck. You know, I was wandering around in a daze. He had said to me, I'm going to die, Don. He said, but it's okay. He said, hell, everybody's got to die sometime. And I'm wandering around in a daze, and I'm saying, why did he tell this to me? I mean, I understand that he doesn't want his daughters and their husbands and children to know. I understand that. He doesn't want to tell them until after the Thanksgiving weekend's over, because he's not going to have a chance to have another one. I understand that. But why did he tell me? Why did he tell me? And it took me a long time to figure this out, because I'm kind of dense sometimes. But I know why he told me. You see, Charlie knew he was going to die. He had just gotten the news that day. And he had to tell another recovering alcoholic who would understand what he meant when he said, I'm going to die, but it's okay. It's okay. Everybody's got to die sometime. And I understand that. You know, if standing up here tonight in front of you all, if this is the last time I ever do this, it's okay. It's okay. Because I got to do this deal. I got to see this deal. And I always wondered, what the hell is this all about? What is this life all about? And you see, I got to find out what it's all about. In the time I've been here with you all, I got to find out what it's all about. And you'll have to find out for yourselves too, if you don't already know. I'll tell you what it's all about for me. And again, this is for me. This is not for you. This is for me. If you want it, you can have it, but I'm saying that it's for me. I found out what it's all about. I found it out from a friend of mine in Little Rock. Some of you know him, Joe McQuaney. This is his motto, and I stole it from him, because alcoholics do that. But it's okay, because Joe stole it too, see. This was originally penned by Tolstoy, and Joe stole it from Tolstoy, and I stole it from Joe. And it's the meaning of everything. And it's like all the great ideas. It's the simplest thing you've ever heard in your life. We are born to help one another. That's what it's all about. And I didn't know that before I got here. I didn't know that. So it's like I was telling Bruce before the meeting started, people say, what do you do, Don? I don't know what the hell I do. I don't know how to answer that question. I show up every day, and I try to be of help. You know, how the hell do you put that on a resume, you know? I don't know, but I don't have to put it on a resume. But that's what it's about, and I didn't know that until I got here. Well, so Charlie lived another 7 or 8 months after that. We were real close. And finally comes a Saturday, and he calls me up, and he says, I want you to come over. He says, I got a little work to be done in my garden. He said, I got another guy who takes care of it, but he's out of town, and I want you to take care of this for me. And I said, sure, whatever you say. So I came over, and he had me dig up a couple of plants and put them on bisqueen and set them over here and there. And he had me hammer in some tomato stakes for tomato plants, and I didn't do it quite right. And Charlie looked at me and he said, you are as worthless as tits on a boar hog. He says, you're never going to get this program. And I finished all that work. Anything else? No, go on, get out of here. I'll see you Monday. I said, okay, Charlie. And while I'm driving away, he's sitting in a chair with the oxygen. And he's just looking at me. And I'm looking back at him. And we both just knew, you know, it's over. And that was on Saturday, and Sunday he went in the hospital. And on Monday morning I went over and I saw him. He was real bad. But he said, hi, Don. He knew I was there. And then he died a couple hours later, you know. And today I understand, you see, Charlie called me back to the garden one more time, you know, because he knew he was going. Where else do you get a deal like this, y'all? Where else Charlie used to say, Don, where else can you get a deal like this for just $1? He had to call me back to the garden one more time. And he had to show me, this is where it's at. This is how you do it. This is what I taught you. This is what they taught me and what I taught you. And this is what you will teach the people who come behind you. And you'll keep doing this. He made me promise him I'd get another sponsor, and I did. And I stayed with that sponsor for the next 5 years. And then he had a series of strokes. And we can't go on together anymore. Sure, he's still my sponsor, but just a couple of weeks ago I had to go get another one. And I asked the guy to sponsor me who I sponsored. Because today, he has what I want. And he's got it better than I do. And so now he's going to sponsor me. And, gosh, I just don't know how many more stories like this there are. I mean, I just stumble around running into miracles every day. Running into people with whom I normally would not mix, and for whom I live my life and I breathe my air, just to be in the same room with you, just to talk about the same things that we've learned together and discovered with each other. Gosh, I wouldn't have missed this for anything. What a ride. What a ride. I wouldn't have missed this for the world. I don't know where it goes from here, you know. I just keep showing up every day. And stuff happens. And I meet people. And it keeps going on that way. I often like to close up with this little deal, and I think I'll just do that. I have had this little fantasy from time to time that I was the guy on the beach of the island, and I'm walking down, and in the sand I find the magic lamp, you know, and I pick it up and I dust off the sand, and the genie pops out, you know, and he says, Master, 3 wishes. this little fantasy, when I think about that, I think, if I had known then what I know now, what would I have asked the genie for? And I think that the first thing, if I'd have known then what I know now, the first thing that I would have asked the magic genie for is some of this peace and serenity that I used to see in certain people's eyes. It used to scare me, you know? But I wanted that. And I have that peace and serenity today, almost all the time. Sometimes not, but almost all the time. And I never had that before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the second thing I think I would have asked the magic genie for is just a small group of friends for whom I could just be myself, you know, without having to act the way they act, talk the way they talk, dress the way they dress, do the things they do. And oh, do I have that group of friends today. And it's no small group. It's huge. And every day it gets wider. It has expanded by leaps and bounds this weekend in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And I never had that before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the last thing I think I would have asked the magic genie for is a relationship with my higher power. Not for where he gave me what I asked him for, because my higher power doesn't really give me what I ask him for. He's too smart for that. But a relationship with my higher power just where I thought he heard me. And I want you to know that tonight here in Fort Smith, Arkansas, I absolutely, positively know that my higher power hears me. And I never had that before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. So, now you all know me real good, and that feels good, because I got no secrets now from you all. I'm transparent, and I like it that way. And now that you know me so good, and now that you have patiently sat here while I have told you this story for 70 minutes, you know, we could have told the whole thing in just 2 words. It's that simple. 2 words that some anonymous alcoholic said to me one Saturday afternoon, leaning back in his chair in the back of a meeting room, when he said, "Welcome home." My God, I love you people. I thank you for letting me share with you. Thanks.